In 1872, cattle owners in Harney County, Oregon, started reporting unusual activity. A nocturnal entity that stalked them in the shadows, leaving behind only peculiar three-toed footprints around their homes and splintered barn doors. This presence moved silently through the high desert night, never revealing itself in daylight. Records from this era are scarce and fragmented, with many either destroyed or deliberately overlooked. The few surviving accounts detail a 5-month span during which entire families abandoned their homesteads in the dead of night, forsaking livestock, belongings, and land they had toiled for years to acquire. By the arrival of spring in 1873, a desert expanse nearly 80 square miles lay virtually deserted. The local Paiute people referred to this region as the place where he who leaves no bones walks, consistently avoiding it. The narrative commenced with the family of Thomas Mackenzie, a Scottish immigrant who established his ranch in 1868 on the fringe of the high desert. The ranch was situated 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, where vast sagebrush plains converged with juniper-covered hills. The land was unyielding, yet Mackenzie was a resolute man, accustomed to arduous labor. He resided there with his wife Elizabeth, their 2 sons, 16-year-old James and 14-year-old William, and a hired hand, Juan Vasquez, a Mexican who had spent most of his life in the area and possessed an unparalleled knowledge of the desert. The autumn of 1872 arrived early and brought a chilling cold. By mid-October, nighttime temperatures consistently fell below freezing, and the initial snowfall had already whitened the eastern mountains. Mackenzie and his sons concluded their hay harvesting and began preparing the buildings for winter. Their livestock, comprising 30 cattle and approximately 100 sheep, were moved into corrals nearer to the house. The ranch compound included a primary log house, a barn, a sheep pen, and a small granary for grain storage. A low fence, constructed from juniper posts and barbed wire, a recent innovation in the West, enclosed everything. The first intimations of trouble emerged on the night of October 23rd. Mackenzie awoke to a sound he later characterized as a prolonged, deep howl, unlike anything produced by a coyote or wolf. The noise emanated from somewhere to the north, from the hills, persisting for about a minute before abruptly ceasing. The rancher listened intently in the darkness, but heard nothing further. The cattle in their pens were agitated, and the sheep bleated anxiously. However, these disturbances could be attributed to the cold night and the pervasive presence of desert predators. In the morning, Mackenzie discovered the initial tracks. They originated from the northern boundary of his property, traversed the cattle pen, where the animals were huddled in a far corner, evidently terrified by something during the night, and extended all the way to the house. The tracks were peculiar, 3-toed, approximately 8 inches long, and deeply impressed into the firm ground. The nearly 6-foot stride between prints suggested a large creature moving with significant momentum. The tracks approached the house windows, the barn door, then turned northward, heading back towards the hills. Mackenzie summoned Vasquez. The Mexican diligently examined the tracks, then shook his head. He declared that in all his years in the desert, he had never encountered anything similar. It was not a bear, as bears leave 5-toed prints with distinct claw marks. Nor was it a mountain lion, as the tracks were too large and improperly shaped. It wasn't any known bird either. Although the print vaguely resembled a bird's foot, it was of monstrous proportions. Vasquez added that the native Indians regarded this part of the desert as an ill-omened place and never lingered there. They were reluctant to elaborate, simply stating that something ancient resided in the hills, something best left undisturbed. Mackenzie, a pragmatic man uninclined to superstition, concluded that these were the tracks of a large animal, perhaps injured or disfigured, that had descended from the hills in pursuit of easy prey. He instructed his sons to keep the cattle closer to the house and established a watch that very night. James, armed with his grandfather's old flintlock rifle loaded with buckshot, positioned himself in the barn overlooking the pens. William was scheduled to relieve him at midnight. The second night was clear and frigid. The waning quarter moon offered sufficient light to discern the outlines of buildings and fences. James sat on the hayloft, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the darkness. The cattle remained calm. Time passed slowly, and the young man had begun to drift into sleep when the sheep suddenly grew restless. Initially, it was just a few soft bleats, but then the agitation spread throughout the entire pen. The sheep clustered together in a tight group in the farthest corner, pressing against one another. James rose, fully awake, and gazed out into the night. For a few seconds, he saw nothing. Then he noticed movement along the northern fence. Something large was clambering over the barrier. The silhouette was tall and elongated, moving in an unusual manner. Not like a quadruped, yet not entirely human either. The figure paused momentarily on the top rail of the fence, and in the moonlight, James discerned the outline of long limbs and a disproportionately extended body. Then the creature leaped into the pen and advanced towards the sheep. The young man raised his rifle, taking aim, but his hands trembled. The distance was considerable, approximately 80 yards, and precise aiming in the moonlight was challenging. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot shattered the night's stillness. Almost simultaneously, a cry erupted from the house, signaling that his father and mother had awakened. Within the pen, the figure flinched, turning towards the barn. For a fleeting second, James glimpsed something that caused him to retreat into the depths of the hayloft. There was no discernible face, at least nothing resembling a human or animal countenance. Only a dark oval on which two reflections glimmered in the moonlight, like glass or the eyes of a predator. The figure stood perfectly upright and was over 7 feet tall. Its arms or forelimbs were excessively long, nearly reaching the ground, and terminated in something that, from a distance, resembled claws or hooks. The creature stared at the barn for a few moments, then turned and cleared the fence in a single bound. Its speed was terrifying. The figure darted between the buildings and vanished into the darkness north of the ranch where the hills began. It all transpired in mere seconds. When Mackenzie arrived at the barn with a lantern, James was speechless. His hands shook so violently that he couldn't hold the rifle. His father took the weapon, examined his son to ensure he was unharmed, then descended to inspect the livestock. The sheep were in a state of panic, but were all physically unharmed. On the ground where the creature had stood were the same 3-toed tracks as the previous night. In the lantern light, Mackenzie could examine them more closely. The prints were deep, even in the hard ground, indicating substantial weight. The claws, if they were indeed claws, left 3-inch-long gouges in front of each toe. On the fence where the creature had climbed, Mackenzie discovered something strange. The top rail, a thick juniper log, was cracked as if compressed by a monstrously powerful vise. The wood was scratched and bore long, parallel gouges, as if made by hooks or talons. The rancher touched the damaged area. The wood had been deeply scraped, exposing the lighter-colored heartwood beneath. The family spent the remainder of the night indoors, without a fire, listening to the darkness. There were no further sounds. Only the wind swept across the desert, carrying the scent of wormwood and juniper. At dawn, Mackenzie dispatched his younger son to the nearest neighbors, the Harrisons, who lived 20 miles to the south. The rancher himself, accompanied by Vasquez and his elder son, followed the footprints. The prints led north into the hills. The trail was distinct in the soft soil of the valley, but as it ascended into rocky terrain, the tracks became more sporadic. The men walked for approximately 2 hours until they reached a narrow canyon nestled between 2 low ridges. Here, the landscape shifted. Juniper and sagebrush gave way to stark, black, jagged basalt rocks. A peculiar odor hung in the air. Not one of decay or rot, but something chemically acrid that stung their eyes. Vasquez halted at the entrance to the canyon. He explained that the Indians called this place the Black Rift and never ventured into it. According to their legends, deep within the canyon resided a cave where he who leaves no bones lived. The Mexican added that several years prior, a group of prospectors had attempted to explore the canyon, hoping to discover gold or silver within the basalt formations. Only 2 of the 5 returned, and both were profoundly disturbed, babbling about something that haunted them in the subterranean darkness. One of them hanged himself a week later, and the other succumbed to madness, dying in jail in the county seat of Canyon City. Mackenzie surveyed the canyon entrance. The walls were sheer, 40 feet high, black basalt gleaming in the sun. The canyon floor was littered with rocks and sparse sagebrush. The creature's tracks led deeper into the canyon, between the rocks. The rancher hesitated. Common sense advised him that entering such a place with only 3 men, inadequately armed and provisioned, was reckless. Yet, the unsettling notion that this creature might return, that it now knew the location of his ranch and his family, tormented him. The decision was made for him. A sound echoed from deep within the canyon. The same long, low howl Mackenzie had heard 2 nights ago. But now, in broad daylight, in the heart of the desert, the sound was more distinct. There was an unsettling quality to it, not quite animal, yet not entirely human. The howl reverberated off the canyon walls, growing louder and more distorted until it became a cacophony of voices, as if not one creature but an entire pack was howling from the rocky depths. The horses whinnied in terror. James's horse reared violently, and the young man barely managed to cling to the saddle. Without a word, Vasquez spun his horse around and rode back toward the valley, with Mackenzie and his son following close behind. The eerie howling persisted for another minute before abruptly ceasing, leaving the desert in an unnaturally tense silence, like the stillness before a tempest. They reached the ranch by noon. William had not yet returned from the Harrisons, which was typical, considering the 20-mile round trip consumed most of the day. Mackenzie instructed that the barn and sheepfold doors be reinforced with additional beams. Silently, Vasquez began nailing thick planks to the barn doorframe. Elizabeth Mackenzie, a resolute woman not easily given to panic, nonetheless urged them to seriously consider leaving, at least temporarily, until they could ascertain the nature and intentions of this creature. Mackenzie, however, refused. The ranch was their sole possession. 4 years of unremitting labor, all their savings, the very future of their children. He couldn't simply abandon everything due to some animal, no matter how peculiar its tracks. By evening, he had devised a new watch schedule. All the men would remain awake throughout the night, positioned at various vantage points. Mackenzie himself would be stationed in the house, by the window overlooking the northern side. James would stay in the barn as he had the prior night. Vasquez would take up position in the sheepfold, allowing him a clear view of the eastern and southern approaches. The firearms were inspected and loaded. Mackenzie possessed a new Winchester rifle, model 1866, a dependable and precise weapon. James carried his grandfather's venerable flintlock rifle. Vasquez was equipped with a well-worn revolver and an old Mexican musket, which he kept more for sentimental reasons than for practical use. Ammunition and gunpowder were plentiful. The third night was overcast. The moon was obscured, and the darkness was almost complete. Mackenzie sat by the window, peering intently into the night. The minutes crept by. The cattle in the pens had been restless at sunset, pacing in circles, snorting, and shuffling their hooves. The sheep, uncharacteristically, had not settled down to sleep, which was odd, as they usually calmed with the onset of darkness. Around midnight, the clouds thinned slightly, revealing glimpses of faint starlight. In this dim illumination, Mackenzie discerningly observed a silhouette against the northern fence. The creature had returned. This time, it made no attempt to scale the fence. The figure stood outside the enclosure, utterly motionless, its posture strangely taut, like a predator poised to strike. It was so towering that its head, if it could be characterized as such, was level with the top rail of the fence, approximately 7 feet above the ground. Mackenzie slowly raised his rifle, endeavoring to make no sound. The distance was about 100 yards, the maximum effective range for an accurate shot in the profound darkness. He took aim, striving to keep the front sight centered on the dark silhouette, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot illuminated the yard with a brilliant flash, and in that fleeting instant of light, Mackenzie saw the creature in its entirety. Its body was elongated, covered with something that could have been fur, feathers, or scales. It was impossible to discern in the rapid flash. Its limbs were disproportionately long, with joints set at angles unnatural to humans or any known animals. The head was elongated, almost triangular, reflecting 2 bright, glowing spots. Eyes that burned in the darkness with a greenish luminescence. The bullet had found its mark. Mackenzie distinctly heard the impact, not the soft thud of flesh, but something harder, like a strike against wood or bone. The creature convulsed, emitting a sound that was neither a howl nor a growl, but something in between. A long, grating noise that caused the house windows to rattle. Then it moved. The speed was astonishing. The figure did not run, it leaped. One colossal jump carried it over the fence, across the entire paddock, directly to the barn wall. The impact shook the structure. Mackenzie heard the splintering of wood, James's scream from within. Then a shot, a second, a third. The creature was assailing the barn wall. The planks groaned and fractured as if they were not sturdy juniper, but brittle twigs. Mackenzie dashed from the house, reloading his rifle as he went. Vasquez was already hurrying away from the sheepfold, waving his lantern. In the lantern's glow, they saw that the eastern wall of the barn had caved inward, forming a hole about 4 feet wide. The creature was gone. Sounds of a struggle emanated from inside. James's cries, the roar of an enraged animal. Mackenzie barely remembered covering the distance to the barn. He burst through the main door, with Vasquez following close behind, holding the lantern. The interior was choked with dust and hay, and the air was thick with a sharp, acrid chemical odor that stung his throat. In the far corner, near the breached wall, James lay on his back, his face concealed by his hands. A dark figure loomed over him. Vasquez shouted something in Spanish and flung the lantern at the creature. The glass shattered. The oil ignited, momentarily illuminating the barn with a blinding flash. The creature recoiled from the fire, and in that light, Mackenzie finally saw it with clarity. Its skin was gray-green, shiny as if wet, covered with plates resembling scales or chitin. Its body was humanoid in form, but distorted, elongated, with disproportionately long limbs. Its hands ended not in fingers, but in 3 long clawed appendages curved like hooks. The head was narrow, elongated backward, with no visible ears. The eyes, 2 large ovals glowing with a greenish light, were situated on the sides of the head, likely affording it an almost circular field of vision. There was no mouth in the human sense, only a slit surrounded by chitinous plates, which opened with that same protracted grinding sound. Mackenzie fired at point-blank range. The creature recoiled and turned toward him. There was a dent where the bullet had struck its chest, but there was no blood, no visible wound. It was as if the bullet had impacted bone or armor beneath the skin and failed to penetrate. It took a step toward the farmer. Vasquez grabbed his revolver and emptied all 6 bullets at point-blank range. The noise in the enclosed space was deafening. Several bullets struck, leaving dents in the creature's body. But it only slowed. It did not stop. Then the Mexican seized a pitchfork hanging on the wall and threw it with such force that the handle vibrated. One of the tines pierced the skin on the creature's shoulder. A liquid flowed from the wound. Not red blood, but something dark, almost black, viscous like tar. The odor became unbearable, chemically acrid, nauseating. The creature emitted a higher, almost shrill sound and retreated to the hole in the wall. The fire from the broken lantern was already spreading through the hay on the floor, filling the room with smoke. The figure turned and leaped through the hole in one swift movement. Mackenzie managed to fire another shot after it, but in the darkness and smoke, it was impossible to tell if he had hit it. Vasquez pulled James out into the street, and the farmer followed them. They ran to a safe distance and turned around. The barn was ablaze. The fire spread rapidly, fueled by dry hay and old wood. Within minutes, the flames engulfed the entire building, shooting up into the sky in a column of sparks and smoke. The light from the fire illuminated the entire yard, casting sharp, flickering shadows. In this light, Mackenzie examined his son. James was alive, but in shock. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his breathing rapid and shallow. His left shoulder bore deep scratches that tore through the fabric of his shirt and the skin beneath it. 3 parallel gashes, as if from claws, bled profusely, but the injuries did not appear to be life-threatening. Vasquez tore his own shirt and bandaged the wounds. The young man was silent, unresponsive to questions, merely staring at the burning barn. Elizabeth Mackenzie rushed out of the house when she heard the shots and saw the flames. She took her son inside to properly treat his wounds. Mackenzie and Vasquez remained behind to watch the fire, ensuring the sparks did not spread to other buildings. The barn was lost, but the rest could be saved. Fortunately, the wind was blowing from the south, carrying the sparks away from the house and other structures toward the open desert. An hour later, all that remained of the barn were black, smoldering ruins and a pile of hot coals. The men kept watch for the remainder of the night, monitoring both the coals and the surrounding darkness. The creature did not return. At dawn, when the first light painted the eastern sky gray and pink, they inspected the scene. The hole in the barn wall was enormous. The boards weren't merely broken. They had been torn out, ripped apart, as if a monstrous hand had simply flung them aside. Some of the 4-inch thick beams were snapped in half. On the ground, amidst the debris, there were traces of the same 3-toed shape, deeply imprinted in the mud. But what struck Mackenzie most was something else. On one of the boards, torn out and cast aside, there was a patch of that dark, viscous liquid, the creature's blood. In the daylight, it looked like resin or tar, black with a greenish tinge. The smell was sharp, chemical, and made his head spin. Mackenzie carefully touched the liquid with a stick. The substance was sticky, stringy, and the wood beneath it began to darken as if rotting. Within a few hours, the spot where the blood had been became a black, rotten stain, and the wood crumbled to dust at the touch. Around noon, William returned, and with him came Samuel Harrison, their neighbor, along with his eldest son, Jacob. The Harrisons were strong, practical farmers, individuals not prone to flights of fancy or superstition. Upon seeing the tracks Mackenzie presented, hearing about the assault, and observing James's injuries, their demeanor shifted considerably. Samuel Harrison, a man of few words, meticulously inspected the footprints and shook his head in concern. He then recounted having encountered similar tales before, not in this specific locale, but further north in Washington Territory, his previous residence before relocating to Oregon. There, loggers spoke of an entity that prowled the forests at night, leaving peculiar tracks and attacking isolated cabins. The indigenous tribes referred to it by various names, but the underlying description remained consistent. an ancient beast, a predator that hunted not merely for sustenance, but for something more profound. He added that his grandfather, a seasoned hunter who had spent many years in the wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, had shared similar stories about creatures that were neither human nor animal, dwelling in deep caverns or shadowed forests, meticulously avoiding daylight. His grandfather called them the ancient walkers, and asserted that the most effective defenses against them were fire and iron. Ordinary bullets had little impact, but these beings feared fire, and red-hot iron could inflict wounds upon them. Mackenzie inquired about the recommended course of action. Harrison's response was straightforward. Depart immediately, without waiting for the approaching night. This creature, he warned, would undoubtedly return. More persistent, more aggressive, especially since it was now injured. A wounded predator, he emphasized, is the most perilous. The ranch, after all, comprised only buildings and land. They could abandon it for now and return later, once a sufficient number of armed individuals and dogs had assembled for a proper hunt. However, remaining here with his family, with his children, at this moment, would be suicidal. Mackenzie wavered. His entire life's toil was invested in this ranch. Yet, observing his wife's pallid complexion, James's bandaged shoulder, and the terror in his younger son's eyes, he recognized that no other option remained. They began to pack, prioritizing only the absolute essentials: clothing, food, weapons, and land deeds. The cattle had to be left behind. There simply wasn't enough time or means to drive 30 head of cattle and 100 sheep 20 miles before nightfall. Mackenzie opened the gates of the corrals, hoping the animals would disperse across the vast desert, allowing at least some of them to survive. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the wagon was loaded. 2 horses were hitched to the wagon, and the riding horses were tethered behind it. Elizabeth and her sons occupied the wagon amidst the bundles of belongings. Mackenzie and Vasquez rode on horseback, their firearms at the ready. The Harrisons volunteered to accompany them, and so, the caravan comprising 2 wagons and 5 horsemen set off south, away from the ranch, away from Black Rift and whatever lurked there. The journey to the Harrisons' ranch proved longer than anticipated. The wagons proceeded slowly along the rugged road, and the sun was already descending towards the west when they had covered the initial 10 miles. Mackenzie continuously cast glances backward, scrutinizing the northern hills. The sky was unblemished, the day bright, yet an unsettling apprehension clung to him. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, as they navigated a particularly rocky stretch where the road snaked between low cliffs, the horses began to exhibit unease. Initially, it was a subtle nervousness. The animals snorted, twitched their ears, and cast sidelong glances. Then, the agitation escalated. Vasquez's horse suddenly reared, almost dislodging its rider. The draft horses whinnied with fear, attempting to halt. Harrison, riding ahead, raised his hand, bringing the caravan to a standstill. Everyone froze, listening intently. For a few moments, silence prevailed, broken only by the wind rustling through the sagebrush and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, a sound emerged. It was the same long, low howl that Mackenzie had heard twice before, but this time, it emanated not from the far-off hills, but from somewhere very close, from the rocks to the right of the road. The howl persisted for about 30 seconds before ceasing, and a responsive howl echoed from the left, from another cluster of rocks. Then, a third howl from the front, obstructing their path. There were clearly multiple creatures. Harrison spun his horse around, his face etched with tension. He yelled for everyone to turn back and ride away as quickly as possible. Mackenzie offered no protest. The wagons maneuvered with difficulty on the narrow road, the horses resisting, sensing imminent danger. As they finally began to retreat, a figure sprang from the rocks on the right. It resembled the creature that had assailed the ranch, but it was smaller and more slender. Its movements were swift and erratic, like those of a colossal insect. The figure darted between the wagons, running directly in front of the draft horses, causing them to swerve sharply. One wheel of Mackenzie's wagon veered off the road and became mired in the soft soil. The wagon tilted and came to a halt. Elizabeth and her sons scrambled out of the wagon. Mackenzie and Vasquez dismounted their horses, attempting to free the wheel. At that precise moment, two more figures emerged from the rocks, one from the left, one from the front. They did not approach immediately, but instead stood about 50 yards away, observing. In the daylight, they were distinctly visible. The creatures varied in size. The one that had initially run was approximately 6 feet tall with shorter limbs. The other two were larger, 7 feet or more, and more heavily built. All of them stood upright on 2 legs, but their postures were unnatural, their joints bending at peculiar angles. Their heads rotated independently of their bodies, tracking the movements of the humans. The greenish luminescence of their eyes was discernible even in the bright daylight. Harrison fired at the closest figure. The bullet struck, and the creature flinched, but did not falter. It emitted that grating sound and took a few steps forward. Jacob Harrison, Samuel's son, discharged his shotgun. At that range, the pellets scattered, and the impact was minimal. The creatures began to close in. Vasquez abandoned his effort to free the wagon. He seized Elizabeth Mackenzie's hand and shouted for the boys to run towards the Harrisons' wagon. Mackenzie covered their retreat, firing at the approaching creatures. One of them, the smallest, suddenly lunged forward with astonishing speed. It traversed 20 yards in a single second and leaped onto Mackenzie's wagon. The force of the impact toppled the wagon onto its side. Boxes and bundles of belongings scattered across the ground. The creature stood on the overturned wagon, its clawed limbs clinging to the wood, tearing through the boards as if they were paper. Mackenzie fired at point-blank range, aiming for its head. The bullet struck the side of its head, knocking the creature off the wagon. It fell, but almost instantly sprang back up, seemingly unharmed. Harrison drove his wagon closer. Everyone, Mackenzie, Vasquez, Elizabeth, and the boys, clambered aboard. Harrison cracked his whip, and the horses, frantic with terror, bolted forward. The wagon careened down the road, bouncing over the rocky terrain. The creatures pursued them. They ran, maintaining pace with the wagon. Their speed was terrifying. Their long, leaping strides carried them over the uneven ground faster than the horses could pull the loaded wagon. They did not attempt to overtake them immediately, but maintained a distance of about 30 yards, simply following, pursuing like a pack of wolves wearing down their prey. Mackenzie and Harrison fired back from the moving wagon, but their accuracy was almost non-existent. A few bullets found their mark, momentarily slowing the creatures, but not stopping them. Their ammunition was dwindling. Mackenzie had 5 rounds remaining in his Winchester. Harrison had approximately 10. Vasquez reloaded his revolver, but knew that at this distance, and from a moving wagon, it was practically futile. The chase endured for over an hour. The sun was sinking towards the horizon, casting lengthy shadows. The horses began to tire, their pace slackening. The creatures, however, showed no signs of fatigue. They continued their relentless, patient pursuit. When they were about 5 miles from the Harrisons' ranch, an event occurred that saved them. Ahead on the road, a group of horsemen appeared. 8 well-armed men, riding in formation. They were residents of the nearby town of Burns, who were heading towards the Mackenzie ranch after hearing from William about the attack. Seeing the wagon hurtling at full speed and the pursuers behind it, the horsemen stopped, dismounted, and took up positions. They possessed good rifles, fresh ammunition, and were unwearied by hours of pursuit. As the wagon sped past them, they opened fire on the creatures. 8 rifles discharged almost simultaneously. The bullets struck their targets, and this time, the effect was palpable. The creatures halted and recoiled. One of them, the smallest one that had overturned Mackenzie's wagon, collapsed to the ground, riddled with bullets. Dark liquid flowed from its wounds, forming puddles on the ground. The creature twitched, emitting that grinding sound, but could not regain its footing. The other two hesitated. They stood at a distance, observing, their heads swiveling from their injured kin to the armed men. Then, as if on cue, they turned and fled back towards the hills to the north. Their retreat was even swifter than their pursuit. In a matter of seconds, they vanished among the rocks, melting into the deepening evening shadows. The horsemen cautiously approached the wounded creature, rifles at the ready. It was still moving, but weakly and erratically. One of the men, identified as Thomas Wright, the sheriff of Harney County, ventured closer than the others. He examined the creature in the fading light of the setting sun, then instructed the others to step back. A dark liquid, the creature's blood, spread across the ground. Everywhere it touched, the grass began to blacken, curl, and decay. The stench was oppressive, acrid, causing their eyes to water and their throats to burn. Wright retrieved a flask of whiskey, poured its contents onto the creature, then threw a burning match. The flames erupted fiercely. The creature ignited almost instantly, its body burning with a hiss and crackle, emitting thick black smoke. The odor intensified, becoming chemically acrid, inducing nausea. The men recoiled, covering their faces with handkerchiefs. The creature thrashed in anguish for a few more moments before falling utterly silent. Within 5 minutes, all that remained was a scorched, smoldering mass, barely identifiable as having once been alive. Wright promptly ordered everyone to move. Remaining there after dark was too perilous. The caravan, now bolstered by 8 armed horsemen, journeyed towards Harrison's ranch. They arrived at dusk, just as the last rays of light vanished from the horizon and stars began to pepper the sky. Harrison's ranch was both larger and more substantially fortified than the Mackenzies. The main dwelling was a 2-story structure, crafted from thick logs, featuring small windows and robust shutters. The barn and granary, constructed with stone foundations, offered enhanced fire resistance. All the buildings were encircled by a sturdy, 5-foot-tall fence made of oak. Wright quickly organized the defenses, positioning his men around the perimeter, setting up shifts for guard duty, and verifying the supply of weapons and ammunition. They possessed around 20 assorted rifles, several shotguns and revolvers, with enough ammunition to sustain a protracted siege. Additionally, Harrison maintained a considerable store of kerosene for lamps, approximately 20 gallons in metal containers. Wright instructed these to be brought inside the house and kept ready. Women and children were directed to the second floor, deemed the safest location. The men took up positions on the first floor, on the porch, in the barn, and within the shed. In total, 17 individuals on the ranch were capable of handling firearms. Wright harbored hopes that such numbers and firepower would deter the creatures until dawn. By morning, a messenger could be dispatched to Burns for reinforcements, allowing for the assembly of a proper squad and an organized hunt. The night was moonless and frigid. Temperatures plummeted below freezing, frosting the ground with a silvery sheen. The sky was pristine, blanketed with stars, the Milky Way stretching in a luminous band from one horizon to the other. On such a clear night, visibility was sufficient to discern large moving objects up to 50 yards away. The first indications appeared around 9 o'clock in the evening. The cattle in the pens grew agitated, horses snorted and shuffled, and cows mooed restlessly. Harrison's dogs, 2 sizable sheepdogs that typically barked at any movement, fell silent. They huddled under the house porch, whimpering softly and trembling uncontrollably. Then came sounds, not the familiar howling, but something distinct. A series of brief clicking noises, as if someone or something was communicating through an unusual language of clicks and screeches. The sounds emanated from several directions simultaneously, from the north, east, and west, suggesting the ranch was encircled. Wright commanded everyone to remain quiet and abstain from shooting without explicit orders. Ammunition was precious, and expending it on shots in the dark would be wasteful. The men froze at their posts, peering into the night, fingers poised on their triggers. Around 10 o'clock, the first figures emerged. Dark silhouettes became visible at the edge of perception, about 70 yards from the fence. Their movement was peculiar, not in a straight line, but in zigzags, jerky, pausing and resuming. Counting them in the darkness was challenging, but Wright estimated at least a dozen, possibly more. The creatures did not immediately approach, maintaining their distance, circling the ranch, scrutinizing, observing. The clicking continued, growing more frequent and intense. It seemed the creatures were communicating, coordinating their actions. The assault commenced abruptly, around 11 o'clock. Without warning, without a howl, a figure darted from the gloom and charged towards the northern fence. So swift was its movement that the guard in that sector had no time to react. The creature cleared the 5-foot fence in a single leap, landing in the yard. Wright bellowed the command to open fire. 3 rifles discharged almost simultaneously. The creature flinched from the bullets but remained upright, turning to rush towards the barn where several people were positioned. 2 more shots rang out, this time at close range. The creature collapsed, but almost immediately, 2 more figures vaulted the fence from the east. Chaos erupted. The creatures attacked rapidly and coordinately from multiple directions. They did not immediately seek to kill, but aimed to disorient the defenders, isolating groups from one another. Their speed and power made them difficult targets, even for seasoned shooters. Mackenzie, stationed on the house's porch, observed one creature approaching the barn where Vasquez and 2 other men were sheltered. The farmer took aim and fired, missing. The creature leapt onto the barn wall, tearing at the boards with its clawed limbs. The wood groaned and splintered. Shots erupted from within, Vasquez firing through the newly created openings. Harrison, on duty on the first floor of the house, hurled a bottle of kerosene, lit with a rag, through the window. The makeshift incendiary shattered near the creature, erupting in flames that engulfed it. The creature recoiled from the fire, emitting that cacophonous grinding sound. Another plume of fire rose from the southwest. Someone else was employing kerosene. Fire proved an effective deterrent. The creatures feared it, keeping their distance from the burning puddles. Wright shouted for everyone to utilize kerosene, instructing them to create a fiery barrier. The men began tossing bottles filled with the incendiary mixture over the fence, forming a semicircle of flames around the structures. The attack persisted for approximately half an hour. The creatures attempted to locate breaches in the wall of fire, but each time they were met with rifle fire. 3 were killed, their bodies incinerating behind the fence, emitting dense black smoke. Several men sustained injuries. The creature's claws left deep scratches, but severe wounds were averted. Around midnight, the attack ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The remaining creatures retreated into the darkness and vanished. The clicking sounds faded, growing fainter, until they died out completely. For several minutes, silence reigned, broken only by the crackling of burning kerosene and the heavy breathing of the men. Wright permitted no one to relax. He understood this could be a tactic to wear down the enemy with feigned attacks and withdrawals. He ordered reinforcements for the guards, replenishment of ammunition, and preparation of more incendiary mixtures. The kerosene fires burned all night, casting a bright perimeter around the ranch. The second assault commenced around 3 o'clock in the morning, in the deepest hour before dawn. This time, the creatures employed a different strategy. They did not leap over the fence, but began methodically dismantling it from several points concurrently. Their strength was immense. Fence posts, embedded 2 feet into the ground, were ripped out and tossed aside. Boards snapped like dry twigs. The men fired, striving to halt the destruction. Yet, in the darkness, and with the creature's rapid movements, most shots missed their targets. Their ammunition dwindled. Some had only 3 or 4 rounds remaining. The situation grew critical. Then Harrison made a decision. He possessed a large metal tank holding about 10 gallons of kerosene, kept as a reserve. He ordered the tank moved to the center of the yard, the lid opened, and a lengthy wick prepared. The plan was audacious: to create a massive fiery explosion that would repel the creatures and buy them time until dawn. As the creatures breached the northern fence and began entering the yard, Harrison ignited the wick, and everyone retreated into the house, slamming and barricading the door. The fuse burned slowly, allowing the creatures time to approach the tank. The explosion occurred around 3:30 a.m. The kerosene tank detonated with a deafening blast, sending a column of flame 20 feet into the air. Burning kerosene scattered in all directions, creating a sea of fire in the middle of the yard. Several creatures that were too close were engulfed in flames. Their screams were so piercing, they made one's ears ring. They writhed in the fire for moments before collapsing, charred. The remaining creatures recoiled from the flames. The fire blazed intensely, illuminating the entire courtyard with a bright, flickering light. In this harsh illumination, the people inside the house saw them in large numbers for the first time. There were more of them than previously imagined. Approximately 20 figures standing outside the burning perimeter, their silhouettes sharply defined against the dark sky. They varied in size, ranging from 6 to 8 feet tall. Some were more massive, others leaner, but all shared the same fundamental form. Elongated bodies, long limbs, triangular heads with glowing eyes. And they were all fixated on the house. Silence endured for several minutes. The creatures stood motionless, watching. The occupants of the house also froze, fearing to stir. The fire burned between them, an insurmountable barrier. Then, as if on cue, the creatures began a slow, unhurried retreat, moving away from the ranch towards the northern hills. Figure by figure, they vanished into the darkness until only the largest remained, about 8 feet tall and massive. It stood at the edge of visibility, at the border of the fire's light. Wright, observing from the window, later recounted the impression that the creature was looking directly at him, not merely at the house, but straight into his eyes through the window. Its gaze was meaningful, intelligent, not the stare of an animal, but that of something comprehending, assessing, and deciding. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. The fire continued to burn until dawn. The men remained in their shelters, weapons poised, but the strange beings did not reappear. As the first rays of sunlight cast over the eastern sky, a profound sense of relief, almost tangibly, permeated the air. Dawn revealed a scene of devastation. The perimeter fence was breached in multiple locations. The yard was scarred with numerous deep tracks, dozens of three-toed impressions marring the ground. 3 charred corpses of the creatures lay strewn about, emitting a repulsive odor of burnt flesh and chemicals. The barn had sustained partial damage, with one wall having collapsed. The shed, though still standing, had its door ripped from its hinges. Almost all of the livestock in the pens had miraculously survived. While the animals were in a frenzy, requiring hours to calm, only one individual sustained severe injury. Jacob Harrison suffered a deep gash on his back during an attack by one of the creatures on his position. The wound was treated, and the bleeding was stopped, but he urgently required a physician. Wright dispatched 2 riders to Burns to request reinforcements and medical assistance. The remaining men began to fortify their defenses, preparing for a potential further assault that night. However, with the full arrival of day, it became evident that the creatures had departed. Their tracks led northward, towards Black Rift, and further into the uninhabited wilderness. By midday, help arrived. 25 armed men from Burns, accompanied by tracking dogs, made their way to the ranch. A doctor who attended to the wounded was among them. Also present was Reverend Edward Thomas, a clergyman who insisted on examining the bodies of the creatures. The Reverend meticulously studied the charred remains for an extended period. He then instructed that they be doused with kerosene once more and thoroughly incinerated until only ash remained. The ash was collected into iron barrels, sealed, and buried in a secluded spot. Reverend Thomas recounted a similar incident from his youth in Massachusetts. At that time, it was labeled as devilry, and everything associated with those events had been similarly consumed by fire. He strongly advocated for the same course of action here. Over the subsequent days, an expedition to Black Canyon was organized. 40 armed men, equipped with a week's worth of provisions, dogs, and gunpowder, set out for the canyon. Mackenzie was part of this group, despite his wife's earnest pleas for him not to go. Yet, the farmer felt a strong urge to discover what lay deep within the rift, and to ensure the threat was entirely neutralized. They reached the canyon on the second day. The location was precisely as Vasquez had described. Towering black basalt walls, a constricted passage, and a peculiar scent pervading the air. The creature's tracks led deeper into the chasm. The expedition proceeded with caution, maintaining a close formation. The canyon extended approximately a mile into the hills, its walls gradually narrowing until they formed a crevice merely a few feet wide. At the termination of this crevice was a cave, a dark opening in the rock face, roughly 8 feet high and 6 feet wide. The same pungent odor emanated from the cave, now stronger, almost overwhelming. Wright commanded torches to be brought forward. Several men, including Mackenzie, ventured inside. The interior was more expansive than it appeared from the outside. The ceiling ascended higher, vanishing into the darkness. The walls were unnaturally smooth, as though polished, and adorned with strange scratches, grooves, and patterns that could have been either ancient writing or merely claw marks. The cave stretched deep within. After traversing about 100 yards, they stumbled upon the first bones. There were many of them. Animal bones, predominantly deer, mountain sheep, and coyotes. However, there were other bones that Mackenzie, with dawning horror, recognized as human. Skulls, ribs, and limb bones, all stripped clean of flesh. Some had been split open, as if to extract the brains. The bones lay in disordered heaps, intermingled with scraps of fabric and various metal objects, buckles, buttons, and coin. Wright ordered a halt. He instructed that several skulls be taken outside for an attempt at identification. Then, he ordered the gunpowder to be brought forward. They possessed 25 pounds of black powder, originally intended for demolition work, should the need arise to clear rubble. Now, they decided to employ it differently. The bags of gunpowder were strategically placed deep inside the cave, nestled among the bones and rocks. A lengthy fuse was extended to the outside. Everyone evacuated the canyon and retreated to a safe distance. The explosion reverberated at midday. The ground trembled, and a column of smoke and dust erupted from the crevice. Once everything settled, the canyon was sealed. Tons of basalt had collapsed, permanently blocking the entrance to the cave. Wright ordered the location to be marked on the map and declared that the area within a 5-meter radius of Black Rift was to be considered off-limits for settlement. The official justification cited unstable geological conditions and the risk of landslides. The true reason was never officially documented. The Mackenzie family never returned to their ranch. Thomas sold the land through an agent without ever disclosing his reasons. With the proceeds from the sale, they relocated to the Willamette Valley in western Oregon, where they purchased a small farm near the city of Eugene. James Mackenzie carried the scars on his shoulder from the creature's claws for the remainder of his life. He never spoke about the events of that night in the barn when the creature stood over him. William became a teacher, actively avoiding anything related to the desert or untamed wilderness. Juan Vasquez returned to Mexico a year after these events. Before his departure, he confided in Mackenzie that ancient things still resided in the desert, older than the Native Americans, older than the white men, perhaps even older than the Earth itself. He asserted that the Earth remembers what was here before humanity, and sometimes that past awakens. The Harrisons continued to reside on their ranch, though they fortified it to resemble a small stronghold. Jacob survived, but walked with a limp for the rest of his days. Samuel Harrison installed metal shutters on all windows and never again left the house unlocked, even during daylight hours. Sheriff Wright investigated the skulls discovered in the cave. The remains of 5 individuals were identified. 2 belonged to a group of prospectors who had vanished several years prior. The other 3 were travelers and hunters who had disappeared at various times between 1865 and 1871. Officially, their deaths were attributed to accidents and attacks by wild animals. Wright's report, dated November 1872, is still preserved in the Harney County archives. It references an incident involving wild animals of an unknown species and recommends sealing off a specific area from settlement. The precise nature of these animals is not specified. Appended to the report is a map highlighting an area around coordinates corresponding to the Black Rift. In his sermons following these events, Reverend Thomas often remarked that the world is older and more enigmatic than it appears. He preached that there are places inhabited by beings not mentioned in the Bible, but which may have existed before the flood, even before creation, as described in Scripture. He emphasized that humanity must understand its place and not intrude where it is not welcome. When questioned about the creatures, the local Paiute Indians simply shook their heads. They relayed that white people consistently believe the land belongs to them, that they can settle anywhere. However, there are places that belong to the ancients, those who existed before the first humans. These places cannot be claimed, cannot be developed. One can only circumvent them and offer thanks to the spirits that the ancients usually sleep and remain oblivious to human presence. By the spring of 1873, the high desert region, encompassing about 80 square miles around Black Rift, was completely unpopulated. The few families who attempted to settle there soon departed. The land reverted to its wild state. Over 150 years have elapsed. The Black Rift persists on maps as a geological feature. The canyon's entrance remains blocked, and access is restricted by federal agencies, ostensibly due to unstable rock formations. Local inhabitants avoid this location. Occasionally, tourists or hikers inadvertently wander into these parts, but most, sensing an unsettling aura, turn back and leave without fully grasping why. Rarely does anyone remain until nightfall. The few who do choose to camp in the vicinity speak of strange sounds in the darkness. A long, low howl that resembles neither coyotes nor wolves, and clicking noises emanating from the rocks. They also describe the tracks they discover in the morning. 3-toed imprints deeply etched into the hard soil, leading away from their tents and back into the shadow of the hills. Most people prefer to dismiss this as mere imagination, fears triggered by solitude in the wilderness. Yet, the old-timers of Harney County, whose great-grandfathers recalled the events of 1872, know better. They understand that the desert is ancient, that it harbors places where humans should not venture, that the debris at the entrance to Black Rift is not merely fallen rocks, but a seal that is best left undisturbed. And sometimes, on moonless nights, if one stands in certain spots in the high desert and listens intently enough, one can hear clicking sounds resonating from deep within the hills. The sounds of creatures still residing underground in the labyrinth of caves that extend far deeper than humans could reach with their explosion in 1872.